Shining, rare and exotic, from the earliest times silver has been accumulated by the wealthy as an expression of power. And the malleability of this precious metal has made it attractive to craftsmen keen to fashion it to the latest taste. But never more so than in the 18th and 19th centuries, when Britain's rich were richer than ever before, when fashionability was key and silver was available in newfound quantity. In this era, the upper echelons of society built impressive collections of this dazzling metal. And with silversmiths of unparalleled skill flocking to British shores, these collections became expressions of the most exquisite craftsmanship in Europe. I'll be uncovering the British love affair with silver, tapping into the fantastical 18th century world of exuberance, display, creative indulgence. This was the era when wealth and display were focused around the dining table, and vast fortunes were spent on dazzling silver tableware. I'll also explore how exciting new dining styles in the 19th century provided yet more excuse for innovation, before industrialization and mass production began to widen the appeal of this precious metal. These two extraordinary centuries reveal the characters, the dinner parties, and the stories behind internationally renowned silver that takes your breath away. I'm going to immerse myself in the golden age of silver. In Britain, one metal has sparkled more brightly than all others: silver. From Greek and Roman times, silver as coinage represented portable wealth of a very precise value. And this precious metal has always been a sign of status and conspicuous consumption. Monarchs and lords have commissioned extravagant domestic silver. From elaborate water fountains, to delicate egg cups, gilt tea canisters, to stunning basins for washing privileged hands. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the landed gentry were at their wealthiest and most powerful, silver had its finest shimmering moment, gracing the most ostentatious dining tables in the land. The rich were very rich indeed. In 18th century England, the aristocracy represented 0.02% of the population, but they controlled government, enjoyed vast wealth, and owned 20% of England's land value. The display of this wealth, preferably the tasteful display, was every gentleman's privilege. Silver was one such privilege. It was originally sourced from Central Europe, but from the 16th century onwards, we increasingly traded wool and cloth for Spanish silver, mined from great reserves discovered in the New World. By the 18th century, Britain had become a huge economic force, with its merchants trading around the world, creating vast wealth, and the prosperous elite could spend their fortunes on silver. The wealthy, particularly the aristocracy, ever ready to patronise London's renowned and skilled craftsmen, made the most of this precious metal that flooded into the country. But it was here, around the dinner table, where those with money, celebrity or blue blood showed their mettle, where politics, romance and socialising took place, and it was dazzling.
If you were at the top of society, then you wanted the best, and so you wanted the most expensive, luxurious and fashionable objects, and those were made in silver.
So who were the men behind the silver? Men like Paul Crespin, pictured here. Many silversmiths working in England had one trait in common. a background of suffering that belies the beauty and creativity of their craft. David Walloum the Younger, Peter Archambault, Paul de Lameray, these are all French Protestants. In the face of religious persecution, their families fled France in the late 17th century, and in the process changed the face of English silverware forever. The men responsible for this exquisite work, such as this urn chased with shells and scrolls, were of French Protestant origin, known as Huguenots. But behind the sparkle lies an unsavoury story of oppression. Protestants were at best tolerated in Catholic France due to the Edict of Nantes, a law which promoted basic religious tolerance. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked this vital edict. It was no longer legal to be a practicing Protestant in France. The Huguenots were in turmoil. They faced arrest, imprisonment, torture, execution. It was a terrible predicament. To leave France for a Protestant was illegal. Certainly they couldn't take property out of the country. So, if they were caught, they could be imprisoned, sent to the galleys, killed. Despite the high risks, from 1670 to 1710, around 50,000 Huguenots flooded into Protestant England. In London, Spitalfields, on the northeast edge of the city, became a stronghold of Huguenot silkweavers, while leading silversmiths settled here in Soho from the late 17th century. It's now strange to think about it, but at that period, French was a very common language on these streets. The word refugee entered the English language to describe these desolate Protestants. The Huguenots brought their skills, their crafts and their French tastes with them. This was vitally important because in London in the late 17th century, the French court style was the height of fashion, the height of taste. People were importing goods from Paris, imitating France everywhere they could. So can you imagine in London, hundreds if not thousands of skilled French craftsmen suddenly arrived? The Huguenots' refugee status made them willing to work longer hours for lower rates. As a group of outsiders, the Huguenots stuck together, intermarrying and finding work for each other. They quickly established a reputation for the quality of their work. I'm meeting with silver historian Christopher Hartop in a French Protestant church to discuss the refugee struggle. So tell me, what were conditions like for the Huguenots when they arrived in London?
Well, it was probably pretty daunting. 1 and 2 becomes a multitude of Huguenots coming in, and they usually just had the clothes on their backs.
Right.
And so the tide, the public reception starts to turn. So 20 years later, there's a petition to the Goldsmiths Company saying that these Huguenots are taking our work away from us. If you wanted to have a shop and sell your own silver, you had to take it to Goldsmiths Hall, where it was assayed and then hallmarked. And in order to do that, you had to be a freeman of the City of London. Not necessarily a freeman of the Goldsmiths Guild, you had to be a freeman, a member of one of the guilds.
This is fascinating. There were people who wanted to stop them expanding. They could, work a closed shop against them, I suppose.
It did in time. So you find people like Archambault actually becoming a member of the Butchers' Company. Really? He wasn't a butcher.
But the Huguenots had talents the English couldn't compete with.
I mean, this is a typical English piece of silver from the 1670s. It's really a bit like folk art. It's quite crudely done. It's quite light, made of very thin gauge silver. The handles are cast in sand. So you can see there's a lot of granulation, a lot of air holes in it. Because
really
what
interesting.
The people at the top of the social scale wanted were French things. And this is a typical Huguenot-style thing. It's by Jacob Margus and made in London in the 1690s.
Right.
It's a much heavier gauge. It's a Baroque style. It's very simple.
Yeah.
This is done by lost wax casting,
Yes.
where you can get much more detail. And so it's much more highly finished than this.
Well, absolutely. Yes, yes. Baroque was the grand sculptural style employed across the arts in the 17th and 18th century to impress and overawe. It used elaborate ornament inspired by natural forms to appeal to the senses as well as the intellect, and it showed just what Huguenot silversmiths could do. But the silversmith every aristocrat wanted to commission was Paul de Lamery, who lived and worked here in what is now London's Chinatown. The Victoria and Albert Museum describes Paul de Lamery as the greatest silversmith working in England in the 18th century. Now that's quite an accolade. Despite a troubled start in life, de Lamery becomes the most sought-after silversmith of his generation.
Paul de Lamery seems to have had an extraordinary grasp of the market, of contemporary taste. He had an eye on the best craftsmen, and he was also a brilliant networker and had extraordinary business acumen. So it was that combination of skills that resulted in him producing silver which had that must-have quality.
De Lamery's family arrived in London by 1691, settling here on Gerrard Street. It was once a bustling Huguenot heartland. De Lamery, the son of French gentry, now the son of a refugee, followed silversmithing as an honourable career.
He was apprenticed to a goldsmith, and he became free in 1713, registered a mark, and within 3 years he'd been appointed one of the goldsmiths to the king. And in fact, Paul de Lamery himself became a captain in the militia, was extremely successful, and died extremely rich.
The Huguenots took silverware in Britain to unprecedented heights of craftsmanship. When a new decorative style called Rococo swept through the French court of Louis XV from the 1720s, the Huguenots were poised in London to create a British interpretation. Rococo was much freer than Baroque. It was asymmetrical, curvaceous, and inspired by nature, featuring playful riots of flowers, shells, and foliage. The English aristocrats were swept away by Rococo, and it's here that de Lamery excelled.
If you analyse this cup, it's a riot of ornament. If you take away the ornament, I'm not sure you're left with any structure. The structure is subsumed by the ornament. So if you look at the lid, what in the early 18th century would have been a finial, perhaps in the form of an acorn, has turned into a bunch of grapes and is asking to be viewed from every angle. A Rococo object is really inviting you to inspect the detail of ornament. You get the rise of the art of the chaser, the very talented craftsman who thinks in 3 dimensions.
To understand these techniques, I'm visiting contemporary silversmith Teresa Noyan in her Birmingham studio.
Just from one material, there's different examples of what can be achieved in metal. So you can create very fluid forms, and it's a very robust and enduring material.
Repoussé and chasing are the first methods to be unravelled.
So repoussé is a technique where metal is formed by hammering from the back of the piece of metal. So here I'm using a steel punch and a chasing hammer. So repoussé creates a low relief pattern on the back of the design, and this will be the front of the design. And the next stage will be to hand chase the details to add definition to this repoussé relief. With the technique of chasing, you achieve this embossed impression into the silver.
Another surface decoration technique we explore is engraving, used a stunning effect on this piece called Awakening 2. The silver now catches and reflects every ray.
Here I'm going to use a graver tool which has a sharp V shape which then is used to cut and remove the metal.
This is the unforgiving bit, isn't it? Every mistake is, you can't put it right, can you?
That's right, so you do need quite a steady hand. Yeah. And just the angle of cut just creates these light reflecting surfaces onto the silver. So here you have some examples that I've created earlier.
It's very lively, isn't it? Gosh, the light bouncing around, yes. It brings it to life, yeah. I want to relate Teresa's demonstrations to the glorious past masters. I've got a mid-18th century sketch here by Nicholas Bremont of a soup tureen, and I want to find out what he was envisaging.
Well, initially I assumed that the tureen was hand-raised from an oval sheet of silver. This piece is made up of several cast elements, and then the chaser would then use various steel punches to define all the different details. So it looks like it's integrated into the whole object.
Oh, okay.
Just from my own experience of working with silver, there's that almost connection that I have with those past makers like Paul de la Marie.
Although I appreciate the craftsmanship of the silversmiths I've been exploring, it's all too easy to romanticise their world. In the 18th century, the silver trade was a hungry business machine. Successful silversmiths like Paul de la Marie had a huge network of staff working for them, and they delegate or outsource work as a matter of course. They created a brand and they sort of supervised, designed the label really. They kept the quality up, they didn't actually make everything.
I think probably the closest analogy is the car.
Oh.
You buy a car, make of car, because you think it's good. But of course it's a product of lots of different processes, designers, manufacturers. It's something that all comes together. I mean, I think it in no way lessens our appreciation of Lamery.
This dish, made for Lord Maynard in 1736, is a great example of de la Marie's outsourcing. It was created by a mysterious craftsman known only as the Maynard Master, yet it was hallmarked by de la Marie.
It stretches the possibilities of silver. The silhouette is broken up, and it's broken up to invite in the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. I particularly like, again, the characteristic Rococo putti, who's bringing Lord Maynard's coat of arms to life. I think this is utterly astonishing. It's made for the patron as a status symbol, but also to indicate that the patron is aware and is appreciating the extraordinary heights of achievement in the craft of silver making in the 1730s.
Silversmiths at the top of their profession could prosper so enormously that they themselves became landed gentry. The Willome family, who worked extensively for the second Earl of Warrington, had an inspirational rise through society.
They were dealing with enormous amounts of money, comparatively speaking. And because they had so much precious metal, they started loaning it out for interest. And a lot of clients used them as we use a bank today. They would instruct them to pay other bills. And that starts modern banking. Some of them, like the Willome family, were particularly successful.
Yes, of course, yes.
And they had a very upmarket establishment that was basically a bank.
Yeah.
But they also would supply you with silverware from their own workshop. David Willome I, the father, made so much money that he became a very big landowner. Yeah. He bought an estate in Bedfordshire, Tingriff, and became part of the landed gentry.
The focus of silver craftsmanship was on dinnerware. Fine dining held a pivotal role in society. for it was around the dinner table that politics, romance and business took place.
About 4/5 of domestic expenditure was, in effect, in the dining room or for the dining room. Dinners were written about, dinners were reported in the newspapers, dinners were written up in memoirs. Dining was how people were judged at the top of society.
Fine dinnerware by London-based master craftsmen was deemed a perfectly normal expression of wealth, and the examples are eye-watering. The second Earl of Ashburnham commissioned this detailed centrepiece from Nicholas Brimont, which showcased its maker's speciality, the lifelike modelling of animals and fruits. The Jewel Office ordered this elegant wine cooler, one of a pair, by Paul Crespin, to decorate the 4th Earl of Chesterfield's embassy at The Hague. The new ambassador saw the dinner table as central to his diplomatic negotiations. The 6th Earl of Mountrath took prized possession of this Rococo ewer by Paul de Lamery. The Earl was one of de Lamery's most important clients, and his patronage provided the opportunity for de Lamery to stretch his imagination ever further. These magnificent pieces epitomise the great age of silver, but there's nothing like seeing collections of silverware in the great stately homes for which they were made. This is Birmingham Assay, the Cheshire home in the 18th century of the 2nd Earl of Warrington. Between 1694 and 1758, he amassed an exceptionally large portfolio of silverware. And today, although his original collection is not intact, what remains still amounts to the largest group of early 18th century British plate in its original location.
This silverware sums up an era, a metal and a man. Let's take a quick overview of the sensational silver collection. Over 1,000 individual items, 12 dozen silver plates, this huge wine cistern, water fountain, bread basket, the prettiest little silver egg cups. There's silver all over the house. Silver for the chapel, silver candlesticks to light the house. And in the bedrooms, silver toilet services. And for the man who had everything, silver chamber pots. It's a wonderful thing. Silver, I'm serious, amazing. The 2nd Earl of Warrington commissioned 14 of these. Must have been going to the Louvre, a very exquisite experience. As well as a social expectation that fine houses would display silver, there was another core reason why the 2nd Earl of Warrington was such an avid collector. That reason was the man himself.
The house in which the young Earl grew up was in a state of disrepair. He had painful memories of his mother scrimping for money, and his father actually weeping over debt.
When the 2nd Earl inherited in 1694, he acquired not just a great family legacy, I love his family crest with his pair of boars, but also inherited tremendous debts. This really stayed with him. His upbringing gave the young Earl a determination and a particular attitude towards money.
He was determined to turn the fortunes of his estate around.
In 1702, the Earl cleverly but miserably married for money. His wife was Mary Albury, the daughter of a rich merchant, but he loathed her so much, he actually wrote a treatise on divorce. I'd love to show you a portrait of Mary, but one doesn't exist. It seemed he never had her painted. However, he used her money to rebuild the house and improve the estate.
This ready money helped drive the 60-year investment in silver, proudly stamped with the family coat of arms. Warrington was making his mark. The man's passion clearly documented in a fanatical inventory called The Particular of My Plate and Its Weight. The National Trust silver expert James Rothwell understands the Earl's unusually personal link with his silver.
Now here's a very detailed inventory of the silver in the house, compiled by the Earl himself in a rather loving detail.
I was going to say controlling rather than loving. Yes, very much so.
Each piece has a life history, doesn't it?
Yeah, its weight obviously very important because of the capital value of it, but also because it was a way of actually identifying individual pieces. You had the egg frame, egg cup frame.
Oh, yes, egg frame.
Scallop shells, bread baskets.
And there's ounces, and then this is...
ounces and pennyweight.
It seems obsessive, a bit like sort of collecting train numbers. There's pages and pages of this. But some of the descriptions in the industry have been scratched out. Does that mean they've been sold, melted down?
Well, in some cases it does. For instance,
sold?
You have here the table or board to set the sweetmeat sauces on has been changed. That means that it would have been sent to be melted down for something more fashionable.
Yes. Is it all written by him? Not by his steward, but by him?
By him personally. He didn't trust anybody else to do it. Nothing is left to doubt in this document. You know precisely what happens to everything.
The Earl's silver was in the Baroque style, which gained popularity in Britain from the late 17th century. It was dramatic, grand, and boldly sculptural. Indeed, in front of me, all is solid, lustrous silver. Quite clearly, the days of debt were over. Such stunning silver was a financial investment of choice in the 18th century.
The key point to understand is that the constituent parts of silver in wrought plate, as it's called when it's made into objects, is the same as the coinage. So this is your saved wealth, your capital. And it's safe as a result of being in your hands in silver objects. If you ran out of money, then you could send it to be melted down and become coinage again. In times of national trouble, it could be brought in. So in the Civil War, an awful lot of silver went.
Is there another magical element to it?
One thing that's obvious is that it's very shiny, so it's impressive.
So why was a conspicuous display of wealth so important?
Whatever position you had in society, you had to show it. And that was a prerequisite. You had to show it. You were showing that you were both rich and cultivated and up to the latest fashions. So you were at the height of society and you were ruling society.
Silver was a reliable investment in the 18th century because its quality was assured. We can link the craftsman to the masterpiece because of hallmarks. The world's largest office for testing or assaying silver is in Birmingham. Here, I'll investigate the significance behind the tiny marks on all pieces of British silver.
Hallmarking really is one of the oldest forms of consumer protection. Essentially, even today, if you go into a jeweller's or a silversmith's and you want to buy a piece of precious metal, it's a guarantee as you buy that piece that what you're buying is actually what it says on the tin, essentially. Hallmarking really began in 1300 when a statute was passed by King Edward I, who then made it happen in this country that items of precious metal had to be assayed and then hallmarked before they were allowed to be sold.
There are 4 assay offices in the United Kingdom today, each with its own distinctive mark. London uses a leopard's head, Birmingham an anchor, Sheffield represented by a rose, and a castle is the stamp of Edinburgh.
So the hallmark itself has always told us about the quality of the silver, the amount of silver, the precious metal, but it also tells us the person who bought it to be assayed can be either the maker, and they have their own maker's mark, or what we call a sponsor. The date letter is no longer compulsory on silver, which in a way is a shame because from a historian's point of view it will make it very difficult for the historians of the future to date pieces as accurately as we can now. You look at an item and instantly you have an information trail in symbols that will tell you exactly the history of your object.
Knowing that hallmarks can reveal not just when and where a piece was made, but also identify the silversmith who had it assayed, I'm keen to look afresh at the marks on the Dunham Massey silver. I can read a tankard mark by James Schroeder in 1743 with London's leopard mark. And this delightful bell is by Peter Archambault from 1738. It's evident that ordering prestigious silver from leading craftsmen was one part of the equation. the actual ritual of dining off silver was also a huge social statement. In the 18th century, a style called à la Française dominated the tables of the rich and powerful.
The fashionable way to eat was à la Française, and that actually derived from the great medieval banqueting form of eating. That was perfected in the court of Louis XIV, and hence à la Française. And essentially, the whole table was a magnificent display when you came into the room, so there were already silver objects containing food on the table. It wasn't brought to you at the table.
You helped yourself.
You helped yourself. The gentleman would help himself, and he would also help the lady to his side. We have here tureens and meat dishes, and you'd have vegetable dishes as well, and salts, because salt was a pretty... And you notice there's one per diner.
Yes, salt. And then presumably I can imagine servants with a flourish. And there it is, the steam. The silver in front of us is, in a sense, a prelude to what's going on behind. The real theatre's over there on the buffet, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about service to the table. You have all the accoutrements that are required during the meal. And then you have ancestral pieces. You're showing off your antiquity.
But the star attraction of the buffet was the silverware for the service of wine. A water fountain by Peter Arcambo was decorated with the balls of the family coat of arms. The water would be drawn from the fountain to rinse the glasses over this baroque cistern. And the wine itself was stored in a gargantuan cooler packed with ice, as both red and white wine was served chilled. All pieces were proudly decorated with the family coat of arms. So the guests here would read all this, wouldn't they?
He tends to go for comparatively simple shapes, so all the more emphasis is put onto the arms and so forth.
Then the dessert course was the opportunity to show your credentials and indulge in more breathtakingly ornate silverware. This curious object, an epergne, originated in the French court of Versailles in the 1690s. The Earl's epergne is sadly missing, but the Victorian Albert Museum has some delightful examples.
Here we have a wonderful, elaborate piece of silver and glass, both sparkling materials, intended to grace the dessert stage of the meal. Hothouse fruit was just as expensive to produce as wonderful Italian confectionery, and to be able to put little apricots or grapes or other delicacies on your table through the winter was another index of wealth.
English silversmith Thomas Pitts made this epergne in 1764. They were his speciality. The epergne was the triumphant climax of the dinner service, enjoyed from every angle, the huge weight of silver intricately crafted into an exquisite centerpiece required the touch of a master craftsman.
An epergne was going to be the one object that everybody looked at closely. It's on the table, probably throughout the dinner. What we have here is a typical piece of Rococo silver. It builds up, it uses floral elements. The branches, as you can see, are wrapped with leaves. Each of the little baskets has a repeat floral motif around the border. We've got technical competence in that the piercing here is quite complicated. The cutting through, which we see more often on bread baskets, but here it is very pretty and gives a lightness to the whole thing, so that it's springing off the table.
The preparation of food was so important in the 18th century that, as well as copper, silver could be found below stairs too.
Here at Birmingham Assay, we still have this splendid silver preserving basin. It was used by the staff because silver conducts heat brilliantly, and also because of its antibacterial qualities, was very good to use in the preparation of food.
But actually owning a little silver, perhaps some piece of cutlery, was becoming more achievable throughout society.
In 1800, for example, many people would have silver spoons. We're very familiar with the idea that silver is a christening present, and of course that is what happened in former times. A silver spoon was given to a child, and that was personal property to be carried by that individual all through their childhood and into their adult life, and then taken to the table when a meal was prepared. Goldsmiths travelled all around the country. If you wanted a little luxury, you didn't have to come to London for it. The goldsmiths would come to the annual fairs in each region, and the kind of novelty you could buy would be a little travelling set like this, a beaker and a knife and fork and spoon, which you take apart for travelling. This was a very smart present, perhaps for a young bride. These are particularly decorative because they're gilded. The silver has been covered with a paste of powdered gold and mercury, and that's then been fired, and there's a chemical reaction. The mercury comes off as fumes, and in fact, gilders notoriously died by 40 because the mercury ate their soft tissue. But it produces a beautiful effect.
Cutlery was a mere trifle for those at the top of society, like the second Earl of Warrington. Their splendid houses had to reflect the latest tastes, and following silver fashions was a non-negotiable and persistent demand. In the 18th century, as the British Empire and foreign trade expanded, new exotic commodities came from far and wide. Tea from China, coffee from the Ottoman Empire, and chocolate from Central and South America. These are all true luxury items. But luckily enough for the silversmiths, an almost endless list of new items were required to house, display, and dish up these goods. Teapots, hot water urns, sugar bowls, coffee pots, cream jugs, tea caddies, teaspoons.
In the Earl's time, commissioning a portrait was a great expense, and a lot of thought went into it. In the 16th century, a man might like to be shown in his best suit of armour to display his prowess and status, or a woman bedecked in jewels. But silver soon entered the language of portraiture. Now, sitters like to be shown indulging in the new, expensive luxury of tea drinking, with their silver set out on the table in front of them. This, of course, displayed their taste, their wealth, and their familiarity with the new fashionable business of taking tea.
Tea was the principal drink that was had if you had anybody visiting you at any time of day, essentially. It's very much a luxury, and actually you can see that in some of the objects, these tea canisters which have locks in them, because it was such an expensive commodity.
By custom, the women of the household would preside over the ritual of tea. Because the Earl's relationship with his wife was difficult, I suppose things here were different.
In this house, Lord Warrington was on such bad terms with his wife, it's very probable the Earl would have had to perform the ceremony of tea himself. That's absolutely right.
Cool. On top of a great silver tea table by David Willome the Younger sits the Earl's tea service, complete apart from 2 teapots by John Jacob. We have these phantom teapots. We could imagine teapots, 2 teapots.
Yeah. And they would have
the serving of tea was a very precise ceremony, starting with this tea canister by Isaac Liger.
And it has a cap which acts as a measure. So that comes off.
So it's a very precise ritual.
It is.
Yes.
And you would pour the tea out into the cap.
Yes.
And then into our imaginary teapot. You then put water in. It would have been a maid who would have actually performed the task.
Milk is dispensed from a silver ewer by David Willome the Younger. A bit more. That's more like it.
And then the tea.
Then sugar taken from a sparkling sugar box by John Liger.
And sugar being also a very expensive commodity, so the wealth you were showing by performing this ceremony.
Oh, of course, in front of one is a small fortune.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, actually not a small fortune, it's a significant fortune.
Yeah.
All this talk of entertaining, but the one thing I want to do is experience dining from solid silver.
Right, it all feels very special, of course. The objects are valuable, and one therefore treats them with extra respect. I mean, it creates a sense of ritual and theatre and specialness. Does it affect the taste of things as well? I think it does. Other thing, of course, eating off a polished silver plate. I've seen myself eat. A bit disconcerting, never mind. Oh, of course, delicious. Also, it feels, of course, rather hygienic. I know silver has these qualities of being antibacterial, so it's clean. Gets one's senses inflamed, and also, of course, sense in terms of the beauty. One's senses are delighted artistically. I recommend it. What's incredible about the British silver I've seen is the fact it exists at all. In the 18th and 19th centuries, people didn't have quite the same respect for antiquity or craftsmanship that we now have. Many of the pieces that we see here are the survivors. So much plate was melted down to be born again in the latest fashions. But the very wealthiest Britons had no need to melt plate at all. They could buy more. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th century, one family able to keep adding to its considerable silver collection was the royal family. The Prince Regent was a legendary example. Becoming regent in 1811, then King George IV in 1820, his lavish taste and spending sprees knew no limits. The Prince created idiosyncratic buildings such as the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. He also commissioned 4 silver dinner services from the Royal Jewellers Rundle, Bridge and Rundle that cost him over £111,000. That's around £3.5 million in today's money. Excess. Caricatures of the time show the Prince Regent's relentless love of fine dining. And in a cartoon of 1811, an audience playfully covered the Prince's extensive silverware. As the 19th century progressed, one great innovation provided the golden age of silver with a spectacular flourish. A new way of dining was introduced that became a catalyst for innovatory table pieces. The banqueting style of dining à la Française was losing favour. A new fashion called dining à la Russe would take the 19th century to headier heights of creative indulgence. I'm visiting Chatsworth House in Derbyshire to experience it. This is the country seat of one of the wealthiest and most powerful families of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Devonshires. This sculpture gallery reveals their continuing patronage and collecting as a family. But what draws me here is the table in the great dining room, sparkling with silverware. It's set for a prestigious visit by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to the 6th Duke of Devonshire in December 1843. The à la Russe fashion really gripped the nation's imagination. It changed the way we dined and socialised. Indeed, à la Russe is still with us today. It's how most of us dine, particularly in restaurants. But what exactly is it?
Dining à la Française, all of your food was put on the table in various tureens and platters and covered dishes. All the diners would have helped themselves. In dining à la Russe, which is what we have here, the individual diners have their food brought to them by a footman. A bit like we have in a restaurant today. The absence then of all of the pieces in the middle of the table that would have been used to serve gets eaten up with this great wealth of display. It's all about show. There's no practical function other than that some of it provides lighting. It's really just a sort of miniature sculpture gallery running down the middle of the table.
And also I observe it becomes more of an individual affair, because individual wine coolers and even little glass receptacles for cooling one's individual champagne glass, I suppose. Well, I mean, where did this fashion come from? Presumably from Russia. I mean,
yes, dining dining à la Russe. It comes from Russia. It was the Russian ambassador to the French court at the beginning of the 19th century. He became ambassador in 1808, and then, you know, as with so many things at that date, France, you know, sort of spread the fashion.
And presumably it was regarded as, obviously, fashionable, but also more practical. I mean, food would turn around more quickly.
Yes, I think the main sort of advantage of it is that your food would be hot. If you sort of the traditional à la française, the food would be sitting around for a very long time, and it would, you know, go cold.
The Duke commissioned much of this plate between 1813 and 1823 from English silversmiths Robert Garrard and Paul Storr, pictured here. The silver could be easily interpreted by contemporary audiences. The family coat of arms is prominent, represented by stags which support the vase candelabra, and signs of hospitality, such as grapes, festoon the silverware.
This dinner, for Queen Victoria, the Duke would have wanted to give her a really grand event. And we know that the local newspapers described the silver that ran down the centre of the table.
So the silver stole the show.
It did.
One paper wrote, "The display on the table was splendid beyond description. Urns, vases, candelabra, of the most elaborate workmanship, in the greatest profusion. The room is worthy to be the dining room of royalty." What a rave review.
In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution inspired a frenzy of activity. Machines and factories were taking over our cities. Mass production would bring the price of silver down. Rail and steam power provided a distribution network all over the country.
Cities were crowded with people looking for jobs and apprenticeships. The silver trade was an attractive option because it combined the benefits of machinery with handcrafted workmanship.
In the machine age, silverware became more widely available. Bit by bit, the middle classes were getting their hands on what had once been the preserve of the super rich. Birmingham's jewellery quarter is still a thriving hub for silversmiths, but I'm here to visit a factory frozen in time, to get a glimpse of what it would have been like to work here in the 19th century. Now, the dies lie still. The stamps are silent. And the people have vanished. This factory, the creation of Jenkin William Evans, reveals how the business of silver once operated. Jenkin's grandson Tony worked here till he retired in 2008 and sold this snapshot of 19th century silversmithing to English Heritage for preservation and restoration.
Of course, the jewellery quarter would have been a thriving place then, sending products out all over the empire.
I've heard people say that, you know, that after the end of the working day, the roads would be filled, almost like a football crowd. But there would have been thousands of people.
The work here was a team effort, wasn't it? Everyone was working on maybe the same object that went, you know, down the line.
Each product, as it went out of the door, was a product of the, you know, the skill which each individual had put upon it.
Yeah, there was a very prolific company, I imagine, and prolific to, I suppose, to not mass produce exactly, but he wanted to keep the prices down of the objects.
Silver has never been known as cheap, but it certainly isn't sort of in the same area as bespoke silverware. This is silverware which anybody could buy.
Can you tell me about the young chaps, the apprentices, and what was their life like?
The apprentices would have started at the age of 14 or 15, but the life would have been fairly hard. Obviously, they'd have started doing it in a simple way, making the tea and watching the master craftsman, and bit by bit being allowed to do more and more complex things.
And what about the girls? I mean, they had a role here, I imagine, women.
The tasks within the factory were basically divided according to the strength required. You know, the finer work, piercing work and so on, the ladies' more deft fingers, you know, and a better touch would come to place.
Barry Abbott's spent over 20 years at the Evans factory. He'll demonstrate drop stamping for me on a piece of copper. Hello.
Hello.
Now we're going to make something, aren't we?
Yep.
Oh, copper.
Wine label.
Wine label?
Yep.
Well, I assume the object's going to be stamped.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Can you talk me through the process?
Right, basically what I do, I've got a copper blank, put it on the die.
Yeah.
So I'll give it a tap.
Oh.
Then a top
Watch your
blow.
fingers. Ah. Ooh.
Which...
Gosh, it's quite violent, isn't it? So that's the label.
That's
Done.
right.
Gosh, you could make a lot of those in a day, I suppose.
Yes, you make about 500-600.
I guess you had to have your wits about you, though. You couldn't have, you know, after lunch down the pub, you couldn't work this, could you? You get your fingers stamped into wine label.
No, but I mean, you did get used
You've
to
got your
them,
fingers, have you?
Yes, yes, all of them.
Well done.
Yes. But you can imagine, I mean, this is just the one hammer going.
Yeah. The noise, of course, that's the thing. So, I mean, and you're okay? I mean,
yeah, fine,
so
fine.
Interesting.
You know, you just get used to them.
Well, thank you very much for my wine label.
That's fine, that's
treasure
fine.
it.
Okay, then. Bye, then.
The silver trade was a network, a huge network, and Evans was a wholesaler supplying goods to leading manufacturers. Curiously, it didn't have its own maker's mark.
Tell me a little bit how the industry worked.
There were distinct layers to the trade. I mean, you had perhaps have the quality or county jewellers, if you like, being the retailers,
Yes.
and they were being supplied by manufacturing silversmiths who might be very large firms like Elkington's,
yes,
or Walker and Hall, Mappin and Webb. We were one sort of step below that, where they could just buy in from us, but they would buy things as components and then finish them off in their own factory.
Right.
And when they went through to be hallmarked, of course, they would bear their hallmark. And so Evans never existed. And quite deliberately, Jenkin never registered a hallmark. He wouldn't want to destroy any confidence that we would stay at that level, because potentially we could have undercut our customers.
What this 19th century factory reveals is the impact of the Industrial Revolution on silver production. Silver moved from an elitist luxury that the likes of the Earl of Warrington or Duke of Devonshire could afford, to something attainable for all of us. Ultimately, the 19th century saw a huge rise in the consumption of middle-class silver. But it was, of course, a class-conscious age, and no ordinary person would ever dream of attempting to emulate our Earl, the Prince Regent, or Queen Victoria.
You can see a completely different range of products in the 19th century being produced and consumed by the middle classes. Because, of course, in a middle-class household, you didn't have a large number of servants, and managing a silver cupboard, plate cupboard, took a lot of care.
Household manuals laid out the rules most clearly for the middle-class ownership of silver. For example, we read, families who cannot afford plate should economise till they can obtain at least 4 or 5 covered dishes, a sufficient quantity of forks, and 2 sauce-boats of silver, made perfectly plain for everyday use. The service or plate must depend on the fortune. Well, that makes things absolutely clear.
The manufacturers fed that hunger to be acceptable, to know what you should do, by inventing objects that middle-class families felt they needed to have. And one prime example of that is, of course, fish knives and forks. Fish knives and forks proliferated in designs because, of course, you can decorate the blade in all sorts of ways. You can create fishy motifs and so on. You can gild the blade. You can have a handle which might be, as this one is, a mother of pearl. And the silver gives it all class. Fish knives and forks absolutely did not penetrate the upper classes, and indeed still feel uneasy or mock the middle classes for the pretension of eating fish with a particular tool.
What the middle classes now had, the working classes also wanted on their dining tables. And new technologies would send the price of silverware plummeting. It had started with the invention of Sheffield plate, which looked like solid silver, when it was in fact a layer of silver on top of copper. But this was soon usurped by electroplating. Patented in the 1840s and championed by businessman George Richard Elkington. Now anything, however big or small, could be covered with a layer of tantalizing silver and look almost as good as the real thing. Silver moved with the times from the favoured material for upper-class luxury items made by the finest craftsmen to popular status symbols for every man, from dining à la Française to dining à la Russe. And if the rise of silver had been dramatic, so was its fall, and that fall was fast. Today, most people no longer have silver on their dining tables. So what happened to silver the moment we could all afford it?
You could argue that it was electric light which essentially drove silver from its preeminent place, because candles have the wonderful effect of bringing out the ripples in silver, bringing out the handwork. Electric light is a flat light, and so there's no longer that mystery and that flattering glow. Sheffield plate initially, and then electroplating in the mid-19th century, brought down the cost, but also reduced silver status. So it was no longer smart. If your butcher, baker, candlestick maker could have what appeared to be silver on the table, why would grand families think it was part of their status anymore?
New objects of desire began to tempt the social elite.
I think ceramics and glass were great competitors for silver in the 19th century. They were coming up with colourful styles, so you get different patterns. So I think it was about colour at this period.
And silver couldn't really compete with cheaper modern materials.
Today, of course, the easy availability of cutlery in stainless steel has, for the most part, replaced the use of silver flatware.
As I returned to Birmingham Assay, home of the second Earl of Warrington's silver collection, it's clear that a huge part of the metal's fall from favour was a change in Britain's class society. In the early 20th century, many country houses like this struggled to afford the servants needed to keep them running smoothly. Silver needs a lot of work. To keep clean is an act of love or a job you're paid to do. Sadly, many country houses simply couldn't afford to keep their silver. Today, all these fine houses, museums, and factories reveal an obsession with a precious metal that was once a mainstay of British society. Fortunately, collectors like the second Earl of Warrington allow us a tantalising glimpse into the shimmering world of silver, the stuff of dreams, a love affair that's actually gripped the British for centuries.